Retrograde planets are crucially important in karmic astrology because they are telling us more about the reconnection that we establish through them. We typically get a memory coming from some of our previous lives, but in some cases, through retrogrades, we also establish a connection with our future lives. It all depends on specific planetary positions, and on karmic astrologer is to determine whether the memory comes from our previous or from our future lives. However, any retrograde planet is part of our greater soul integration. Many people have more than one retrograde planet in their chart, and we should check all of them because each of them are telling us about different parts coming from different lifetimes into our present life. However, more important retrogrades are those of personal planets, like if you have a retrograde Mercury, and especially if you have Mars or Venus retrograde, because they are not so often retrograde. So if we have them, it's a greater sign than if we have transcendental or generational planets retrograde that are very often retrograde anyway. Depending on the planetary nature, each retrograde planet can bring us different qualities in our life coming from different times. For example, if you're a retrograde Mercury person, we are here to connect with the knowledge coming from our past or in some cases from our future lives. Also, it will reconnect us with the people we know, like our brothers or sisters, siblings, whatever the Mercury is talking about. Also, we are going to the places where we used to be. It's like traveling again, coming to the place which was very important to us. And in some cases, also we have specific missions to do on these places. Retrograde Mercury is not totally present in this life, so you can easily see that people with retrograde Mercuries are like all over, they are not so focused, something can happen, but they are really open to different lifetime memories. For them, a greater soul is what they need to be able to live that. With that capacity, we can establish a real meaningful life with a retrograde Mercury. If you have a retrograde Venus, it's a different story. It's a love story. We want to reconnect with the person we used to be with in some previous lives. Usually comes from a previous because it's emotional planet. In some cases, we can find even our twin flame soul with a retrograde Venus. But this is only in a very special situations if Venus is spectacularly well positioned in our chart. In our other cases, retrograde planets can tell us about the relationship that we have some depth with, or we didn't know how to do that well, how to establish the connection. So we will reconnect again in order to make that relationship work well. In some cases, we have retrogrades just to meet once again, make a balance, and go our way. In some cases, retrograde planets is not a relationship that we will stay with, all the time, that we will continue. It's just that we need to balance it. But in other cases, it's a really part of a soulmate or a twin flame soul, like a really deep kind of a relationship. If you have a retrograde Mars, and it's a very specific, very unusual kind of aspect, just because Mars is the one who is very rarely retrograde. It's not typical to do that. So it tells us about different fights that we used to have in different lives. And it wants us to actually establish a change. So retrograde Mars is behaving very much like Pluto. It actually has some inner change. It is just like we want to change that past. We have the energy to redo the thing. With the retrograde Mars, it takes us in a very similar situation. It could be in some kind of fighting or something else, something related to Mars, like actions that was committed. And now I want to make a new one. I want to rewrite that action. I want to redo it. I want to make that a new way, new direction. So we need to have, I would say, higher states of consciousness in order to work with the retrograde Mars, because Mars is an animal in us. So it is not the one that is thinking about anything. But so with the retrograde Mars, we need to have that silence to be capable of talking to an animal in us and then redo the action. And that means change the karma. So it's a very important inner work. I would say even energy work that allows us to transform everything. It's very magical in itself. However, if person is not really conscious enough or developed enough in its sense, the person might be actually just taken by the memory that was written there. So the person will just repeat the very same action and will react to the circumstances the same way the person did in some previous lives. So Mars is typically a memory coming from the past. Retrograde Mars is, that's why, very demanding but very powerful if we have it. If we are with a retrograde Jupiter situation in our chart, it's not so uncommon, like 1/3 of people have a retrograde Jupiter because it's a generational planet. And Jupiter has even positive effect when it is a retrograde, because retrogradation is very similar to the 12th house influence, and Jupiter is familiar with the 12th house. So it's more like a Pisces kind of Jupiter. It is more like spiritually oriented. So this is the best way. So if we have retrograde Jupiter, let's check what we have in our 12th house, because retrogradation is typical for connecting us with the 12th house memories. It could have been a knowledge that comes from our past life that we developed, and now we reconnect with that. And then whatever Jupiter represents can be very powerful, because once we reconnect or reunite two lives, it becomes much more powerful. Whatever we do, we are stronger. So through retrograde planets, especially Jupiter, we can have really great power, but Jupiter must be positively aspected or working with us nicely. In some other cases, even Jupiter retrograde can represent depths that we have toward Jupiter. Some people have a retrograde planets and even Jupiter, just not because they actually were doing well with that, but just because they actually didn't do well with that. So maybe they have some debts related to the law or to some foreign country. So wherever they travel, they go there, there is something that they need to balance, so to say. We experience that as a karma that comes back. Jupiter, it is usually not so difficult, but we need to check that in a chart particularly. In most of the cases, Jupiter is great, and very often it represents the knowledge that can come from the future life memories. It is really very special one. When we are talking with the Saturn retrograde, again, it's not very uncommon, but typically Saturn, even when it's direct and normal, it tells us about the karma. It tells us about the past life, because every Saturn is just an old Mars. So Saturn represents a consequence of our actions, of our Mars. So whenever we see Saturn, we say, oh yeah, that's a past Mars. So it's again already the past time. That's what the Saturn represents. But if we have a retrograde Saturn, it's even deeper past. It is not the action that started just in previous life, but maybe 2 lives ago or even more. And that action can be in some cases positive. That means if the Saturn is very well aspected, it supports us, but in case it is not, it actually tells us you are repeating, you are here in this time because you need to change the consequences that you have created. Because in that Saturn, we have a Mars, we have a very deep Mars. And this is not Mars from this life, not from the previous, probably 2 lives or maybe even more. So in Karmic Astrology, it is important factor to see what kind of karma is coming, what do we get, and what do we need to balance. It is very important that we know how to work with the Saturn anyway, especially retrograde. It really asks us to dive deep and to establish silence and peace, and to know how to maintain that routine of life that has that peace in itself. Then we are capable of dealing with that and we are okay. Otherwise, it is overwhelming, like experience coming from at least 2 lives ago. It can be sometimes very difficult. If you are talking about other transcendental planets like Uranus, Neptune or Pluto, they're very often retrograde in many charts, they all relate not so much to our personal life, but much more to our generational life memories. We created certain kind of karma that was in the previous life or some of the previous lives, and now it is repeating, but in form of general circumstances, more like a mundane things. For example, if we participated in some revolutions in some lives, so now this retrograde Uranus would actually brings us the flavor of that in certain areas of life. So these kind of things will again show up somehow. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be again a revolution, but the consequence of that collective karma that was created there. It can be positive in some cases, so that person who actually was that revolutionary would continue doing that, like in a positive way, or it can be challenging. And this is just the general effects that we experience through transcendental planets like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Not so personal and not all the time. So the more personal planet, it is more important in our everyday life. In astrology, we also have a very special situation when we have an intercepted sign. Intercepted sign means that no cusp of any house is in that sign. So the question is, how does it work? And the answer is, there is some similarity with the retrograde motion and the intercepted sign. Whenever the sign is intercepted, we say it is not incarnated enough. So it is more like this sign is still vibrating in some other lifetime memories. Very often some of the past life, but in some cases also it represents the memory coming from the future but not ready to come here yet. So it takes some time to be activated. So it is like between worlds, and this is what actually the retrograde does as well. So when we have a retrograde planet, this is also not totally present here. Every intercepted sign has a similarity with the 12th house influence. So it's like a hidden. We don't see it right away. Retrograde also behaves very often as a 12th house. So this is like the similarity between them. Of course, there are some differences because with the retrogrades we have typically repetition. Something repeats. With intercepted, we do not have that part of repetition, but we have that connection between two lives. So it's just like it is a sleepy sign yet. It's not fully present here, but being sleepy, it's like partially in some other time, partially here. And we can use that for our integration of two lives.